Welcome back to Past the Pumpkin's Glow. Before we dive into today's eerie adventure, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any of our haunting stories. Let's dive right into our stories tonight. I moved into my new apartment excited for a fresh start. Everything seemed perfect: affordable rent, quiet neighborhood, and close proximity to my workplace. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about my next-door neighbor, Mr. Thompson. He was a tall, gaunt man in his late 60s with an unsettling habit of peering out his window whenever I came or went. One evening, as I returned home from work, I noticed Mr. Thompson standing at his window, staring directly at me. I nodded politely, but he didn't respond. Instead, his eyes followed me as I walked up to my apartment. This became a regular occurrence, and his gaze grew more intense each time. One night I heard a strange scratching sound coming from the shared wall between our apartments. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was clawing at the wall. I tried to ignore it, but it continued for hours. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Thompson about the noise. He simply smiled and said, "Just fixing something." A few days later, I received an anonymous note slipped under my door. It read, "Be careful. He watches you." Anxiety surged as I glanced towards Mr. Thompson's apartment. I decided to install a security camera outside my door for peace of mind. That night, the scratching sound returned, louder than before. I checked the footage from the camera the next morning, and my blood ran cold. Mr. Thompson had been standing outside my door for hours, just staring. I called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do unless he actually tried to enter my apartment. I started to feel trapped in my own home. I barely slept, always listening for the scratching or footsteps outside my door. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my doorknob turning. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stood silently by the door. After a few tense minutes, the noise stopped. The next day, I saw Mr. Thompson leaving his apartment with a suitcase. He never returned. A few weeks later, I found out he had been arrested in another state for stalking and breaking into someone's home. I still shudder to think what might have happened if he had succeeded in getting into my apartment. When my husband and I bought our first house, we were thrilled. It was in a charming neighborhood with friendly neighbors, except for one house at the end of the street. It was an old, run-down property that seemed abandoned. Little did we know, it was very much occupied. Our neighbor, Mrs. Parker, was an elderly woman who rarely left her house. At first, we thought she was just a reclusive old lady, but soon we realized there was something more sinister about her. Every night, we would notice her shadowy figure standing at her window, staring directly into our living room. It creeped me out, but my husband insisted she was harmless. One evening, while we were having dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Mrs. Parker standing there, her eyes wide and unblinking. She handed me a plate of cookies and whispered, "For the newcomers." I thanked her, but as soon as she left, I threw the cookies away. The staring continued, and I started to feel uneasy in my own home. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our bedroom window. I peered through the curtains and saw Mrs. Parker standing in our yard, looking up at me. I woke my husband, but by the time he looked, she was gone. The next day, I spoke to a few neighbors about her, and they shared similar stories. They advised me to ignore her, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, I decided to confront her. I walked up to her house and knocked on the door. She answered almost immediately, as if she had been expecting me. "Why do you keep staring into our house?" I demanded. She smiled eerily and said, "I'm just making sure you're safe." I backed away and returned home, more disturbed than ever. A few weeks later, Mrs. Parker passed away. Her house was put up for sale, and we hoped things would return to normal. However, one night, I woke up to see her silhouette standing at her window, staring at our house. It was impossible. She was gone. I blinked, and the figure vanished. We moved out shortly after, unable to live with the constant feeling of being watched. To this day, I still wonder if Mrs. Parker's spirit lingers, keeping an eye on her neighborhood. When I moved into my new apartment, I was excited to meet my neighbors and make new friends. One of my neighbors, Mr. Collins, seemed particularly eager to welcome me. He was a man in his late 40s, with a friendly smile and an offer to help with anything I needed. At first, I appreciated his kindness, but soon it became overwhelming. Mr. Collins started showing up unannounced, often bringing small gifts or baked goods. He would knock on my door at odd hours, and if I didn't answer, he would leave notes asking if I was okay. I began to feel suffocated by his constant presence. One evening, I came home to find my door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I pushed it open, fearing a break-in. To my shock, I found Mr. Collins inside, arranging flowers on my dining table. "I thought you'd like these," he said with a smile. I was furious and told him to leave immediately. After that incident, I made sure to lock my door and avoid Mr. Collins as much as possible. However, he continued to leave notes and small gifts outside my door. I reported his behavior to the building management, but they said there was nothing they could do unless he became violent. One night I woke up to the sound of my doorknob turning. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering my situation to the dispatcher. The turning stopped, but I was too scared to move. The police arrived within minutes and found Mr. Collins hiding in the stairwell, holding a spare key to my apartment. It turned out he had stolen the key from my welcome packet when I first moved in. He was arrested and later evicted from the building. Although I felt a sense of relief, the experience left me paranoid and uneasy in my own home. I eventually moved to a new apartment, but I still double-check my locks and keep a wary eye on my neighbors. My husband and I had just moved into our dream home, a charming house with a beautiful garden. Our next-door neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, was a retired man who took great pride in his yard. At first, we thought he was just a bit eccentric, but soon his behavior took a darker turn. Mr. Jenkins would often be outside, meticulously tending to his garden. He was always polite, but there was something off about him. One night, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside our bedroom window. I peered out and saw Mr. Jenkins in our yard digging a hole. I woke my husband, but by the time he looked, Mr. Jenkins was gone. The next morning, we found a perfectly planted flower bed where he had been digging. It was unsettling, but we decided to let it go. Over the next few weeks, we noticed more changes in our yard, plants we didn't remember planting, and new flower beds appearing overnight. One evening, I confronted Mr. Jenkins about his nocturnal gardening. He smiled and said, "I just thought your garden could use some extra care." We politely asked him to stop, but the changes continued. One night, I set up a camera to catch him in the act. The footage showed Mr. Jenkins sneaking into our yard, planting flowers and trimming bushes. It was eerie to watch him work silently in the dark. We decided to confront him again, this time more firmly. He apologized and promised to stop, but his behavior only escalated. We would find strange objects buried in our yard, old toys, broken tools, even a small rusted knife. Feeling threatened, we called the police. They spoke to Mr. Jenkins, but since he hadn't done anything illegal, there was little they could do. The strange gardening continued, and we began to feel trapped in our own home. One night I woke up to the sound of digging again. This time I saw Mr. Jenkins burying something large in our yard. I called the police, and they arrived quickly. They dug up the spot and found a large sack filled with dirt and stones. Mr. Jenkins was taken into custody for trespassing. After his arrest, we learned that Mr. Jenkins had a history of mental illness and had been off his medication. He was committed to a psychiatric facility, and his house was sold. The new neighbors were a young family, and we hoped for a fresh start. But every time I look at our garden, I remember the midnight gardener and the fear he brought into our lives. My girlfriend and I were thrilled to move into our first apartment together. It was a cozy place in a quiet neighborhood, and everything seemed perfect. That is, until we started hearing strange noises coming from the apartment above us. At first, it was just faint footsteps and the occasional thud, nothing too unusual. But as weeks went by, the noises grew louder and more frequent. We heard furniture being dragged across the floor, heavy objects being dropped, and even muffled voices late at night. What made it even stranger was that the apartment above us was supposed to be vacant. One evening, I decided to investigate. I went upstairs and knocked on the door. No one answered, but I could hear faint whispers coming from inside. I reported it to the building manager, but he assured me that the apartment was empty and locked. The noises continued, and we started to feel uneasy in our own home. One night, we heard loud banging and what sounded like a struggle coming from upstairs. I called the police, convinced that someone had broken in. They arrived quickly and searched the apartment, but found no one inside. The place was completely empty, just as the manager had said. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I installed a camera in the hallway outside the upstairs apartment. The next morning, I checked the footage and was shocked to see a man entering the apartment in the middle of the night, carrying a large bag. He stayed for a few hours, then left just before dawn. I showed the footage to the building manager and the police. They conducted a more thorough search and discovered a hidden crawl space in the apartment. Inside, they found signs that someone had been living there: bedding, food wrappers, and personal belongings. The man was never caught, and we never learned his identity or how he managed to enter and exit the building without being seen. The apartment was sealed off, and the building manager changed all the locks. Although the noises stopped, the experience left us shaken. We eventually moved out, unable to shake the feeling of being watched and the fear of the unseen tenant. When I moved into my new apartment, I was excited to meet my neighbors and start fresh. One of them, Mr. Harris, seemed friendly enough. He was a middle-aged man who kept to himself and had a large collection of antiques. At first, I found his collection fascinating, but soon it became clear that his obsession was more than just a hobby. Mr. Harris would often leave his apartment door open, giving everyone a clear view of his extensive collection. There were shelves filled with old dolls, clocks, and various knickknacks. He would spend hours meticulously arranging and rearranging his items. I thought it was a bit odd, but harmless. One evening I came home to find a note on my door. It was from Mr. Harris inviting me to see his newest acquisition. Curious, I decided to take a look. Inside his apartment, I was struck by how crowded and eerie it felt. The walls were lined with shelves, and every surface was covered with old, dusty objects. Mr. Harris proudly showed me a vintage music box he had recently acquired. It was beautiful, but something about it made me uneasy. After that visit, I started noticing strange things happening in my apartment. Items would go missing and then reappear in different places. I chalked it up to my own absent-mindedness, but it kept happening. One night, I heard strange noises coming from the hallway. I peeked out and saw Mr. Harris standing outside my door, holding one of his dolls. "What are you doing?" I demanded. He smiled and said, "Just making sure she's safe." I quickly closed the door and locked it, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The incidents continued, and I became increasingly paranoid. One day, I came home to find my apartment door ajar. Inside, I discovered several of Mr. Harris's antiques placed around my living room. I confronted him, but he denied any knowledge of it. Feeling threatened, I reported the situation to the building management and the police. They spoke to Mr. Harris, but he claimed I was imagining things. With no proof, there was little they could do. I decided to install a security camera inside my apartment. A few nights later, I reviewed the footage and saw Mr. Harris entering my apartment with a spare key, carefully placing his antiques around my living room. I called the police immediately, and they arrested him for breaking and entering. It turned out Mr. Harris had a history of mental illness and had been off his medication. He was committed to a psychiatric facility, and his apartment was cleared out. I moved out shortly after, unable to live with the memory of his creepy collection and the fear he instilled in me. When I moved into my new apartment, I found a roommate, Lisa, through an online ad. She seemed nice enough, and we quickly settled into our new home. Everything was going well until strange things started happening. Lisa worked long hours, so she was rarely home. I often had the apartment to myself, but I started noticing things out of place. My belongings would be moved, and I would hear faint footsteps and whispers when I was alone. I chalked it up to my imagination, but it kept happening. One evening, I came home to find Lisa acting strangely. She was standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the wall. When I asked her what was wrong, she just smiled and said, "He's here." I felt a deep unease and decided to stay in my room for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table. It was written in Lisa's handwriting, but it was incoherent and filled with ramblings about a phantom roommate who lived with us. I confronted her about the note, but she claimed she had no memory of writing it. As the days went by, the strange occurrences escalated. I would hear loud banging on the walls and find doors open that I knew I had closed. One night, I woke up to find Lisa standing over my bed, her eyes wide and vacant. She muttered something about the phantom roommate before walking out of my room. Terrified, I decided to install a camera in the living room to see if I could catch anything on film. The next day, I reviewed the footage and was shocked to see Lisa wandering around the apartment in the middle of the night, talking to herself and moving my belongings. I decided to talk to our landlord about Lisa's behavior. He revealed that the previous tenant had complained about similar incidents and had moved out abruptly. He also mentioned that Lisa had a history of mental illness and had been off her medication. I confronted Lisa about her behavior, and she broke down, admitting that she had been seeing a phantom roommate for months. She agreed to seek help, and I helped her find a therapist. With her permission, I contacted her family, who came to take her home. After Lisa moved out, the strange occurrences stopped. I found a new roommate, and things returned to normal. However, I'll never forget the fear and unease I felt living with Lisa and the phantom roommate. I moved into my new house. It was an old, charming place with plenty of character. I quickly settled in and started making it my own. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night I heard strange noises coming from the attic. It sounded like footsteps and shuffling, but when I went to investigate, I found nothing. The noises continued, and I started to feel uneasy in my own home. I mentioned the noises to my neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, and she told me that the previous owner had complained about similar sounds. She said he believed someone was living in the attic, but the police never found anyone. Her story gave me chills, but I tried to brush it off. A few days later, I came home to find my attic door slightly open. I knew I had closed it, and fear gripped me as I slowly approached. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the ladder, dreading what I might find. The attic was empty, but I noticed some of my belongings had been moved. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I installed a camera in the attic. The next morning, I reviewed the footage and was shocked to see a man crawling out of a hidden compartment in the wall. He rummaged through my things before disappearing back into the compartment. I called the police immediately, and they searched the attic, finding the hidden compartment. Inside, they discovered a makeshift bed, food wrappers, and personal belongings. The man was nowhere to be found, but they believed he had been living there for months, possibly even before I moved in. Police increased patrols in the neighborhood, but the man was never caught. I felt violated and unsafe in my own home, so I decided to move out. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. The experience left me paranoid and constantly looking over my shoulder. I'll never forget the fear of knowing someone was living in my attic, watching my every move. When my husband and I moved into our suburban neighborhood, it seemed like the perfect place to raise our young children. The community was friendly, with neatly trimmed lawns and cheerful neighbors who waved as we walked by. One of the most pleasant-seeming neighbors was Mr. Johnson, a middle-aged man who lived alone in the house across the street. He was always quick to lend a hand and had an easy smile. It wasn't long before we noticed some odd behaviors. Mr. Johnson had a peculiar habit of watching the neighborhood through his curtains. At first, it seemed harmless. Perhaps he was just a concerned neighbor. But the more I observed, the more unsettling it became. His gaze wasn't casual. It was intense and focused, often lingering on the women and children in the neighborhood. One evening, as I was putting my daughter to bed, I glanced out the window and saw Mr. Johnson standing in his yard, staring directly into our house. I quickly closed the curtains, my heart pounding. I mentioned it to my husband, but he thought I was overreacting. The following weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I noticed Mr. Johnson's presence more and more, always lurking, always observing. One night, I heard a rustling sound outside our bedroom window. Peering through the curtains, I saw a shadowy figure quickly disappearing into the darkness. I was certain it was Mr. Johnson, but without proof. What could I do? A few days later, I was chatting with our neighbor, Karen, who lived next door. She mentioned that she had been feeling uneasy too, especially after finding her garden tools scattered around her yard one morning. She suspected someone had been snooping around, but she didn't know who. We decided to keep an eye out and share anything suspicious we noticed. One night, I was returning home late from work when I saw a faint light flickering in Mr. Johnson's basement window. Curious, I slowed down and peered inside. The basement walls were covered with photos of women and children from the neighborhood. I could even spot a few pictures of my own family. There were also shelves filled with small, unidentifiable objects. Panicking, I rushed home and called the police, reporting my suspicions. They arrived quickly and knocked on Mr. Johnson's door. He answered, looking calm and collected, but when they asked to search his basement, his demeanor changed. He became agitated and refused to let them in. The police insisted, and eventually he relented. What they found confirmed our worst fears. Mr. Johnson's basement was a disturbing shrine filled with stolen items, trophies from his voyeuristic activities. There were also more sinister items, pieces of jewelry, children's toys, and other personal belongings that had gone missing from various homes in the neighborhood. The police confiscated everything and took Mr. Johnson into custody. The investigation revealed that Mr. Johnson had been stalking and secretly photographing the neighborhood for years. Worse, he was linked to several unsolved murders in nearby towns, with the trophies in his basement serving as grim reminders of his crimes. The community was shocked, and the news spread quickly. Our once idyllic neighborhood felt tainted by the horrifying revelation. In the weeks that followed, we tried to return to normal, but the sense of security we once had was shattered. I installed security cameras around our house and became hyper-vigilant, never leaving my children unattended even for a moment. The other neighbors did the same, and we formed a tighter-knit community, watching out for each other more than ever before. Mr. Johnson was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Though justice was served, the scars of his actions remained. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the terror of knowing a predator had been living just across the street. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people can be hiding in plain sight. My boyfriend and I moved into our new apartment. The building was old but charming, with friendly neighbors and a great location. Everything seemed perfect until we started noticing strange behavior from the tenant in the apartment below us. Mr. Green was a quiet man in his 50s who kept to himself. At first, we thought he was just a bit odd, but soon his behavior took a darker turn. We would hear strange noises coming from his apartment at all hours of the night. Loud thuds, scraping sounds, and even what sounded like chanting. Evening, we were coming home from dinner when we saw Mr. Green standing in the hallway, staring at us with an intense, unsettling gaze. He didn't say anything, just watched us as we walked past. We quickly went into our apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. The noises continued and we started to feel uneasy in our own home. One night, we heard loud banging coming from Mr. Green's apartment. It sounded like he was throwing furniture around. We called the building manager, who promised to talk to him, but the noises persisted. A few days later, we found a note slipped under our door. It was from Mr. Green, filled with bizarre ramblings about dark forces and warnings to stay away from him. We reported the note to the building management and the police, but there was little they could do without concrete evidence of a threat. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone trying to open our front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Mr. Green frantically jiggling the doorknob. I called the police, and they arrived quickly, but Mr. Green had retreated to his apartment by the time they got there. Police spoke to Mr. Green, but he claimed he was sleepwalking and didn't remember anything. They warned him to stay away from us, but we didn't feel safe. We decided to install a security camera outside our door to keep an eye on him. The next morning, we reviewed the footage and saw Mr. Green standing outside our door for hours, just staring. We showed the footage to the building manager and the police. Mr. Green was evicted shortly after, but the experience left us feeling violated and paranoid. We eventually moved out, unable to shake the fear of Mr. Green and his unsettling behavior. The experience taught us to be cautious and always trust our instincts when something feels off. Thanks for tuning in to Past the Pumpkin's Glow. Dare to share your own spooky experiences in the comments below. Who knows, your story might just be our next creepy highlight. Curious for more creepy tales? Don't just listen to the shadows, join our community of the brave and the bold. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and ring the bell to never miss out on our allegedly true scary stories. Have your own ghostly encounters, sinister sightings, or otherwise scary event? Drop us a comment below. We're dying to hear from you.